to be the enemy of the Jews here, and he has the absolute worst timing of the word in the world. And you're going to see that if you read it or you studied the book as we went through, you see that Haman just has the absolute worst timing. But look at chapter 2. This is up to where we got to last week. We're going to spend probably 15 or 20 minutes going through the book of Esther, and then we're going to look at some other things about how it ties in. So this is just going to be a tour through the book of Esther just to refamiliarize ourselves with it and make some points along the way. Chapter 2, verse 17, it talks about how the king loved Esther. More than all the women, she found favor and kindness with him, more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head. He made her queen instead of Vashti. Well, it drops on down to verse 21. In verse 21, it says, in those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. And who is Mordecai again, just to refresh our memories? Esther's uncle. And remember, the king was a what? I guess there's more than one answer, but the king was a what? Persian. Good, that was the one I was looking for. He was a non-Jew. King was a Persian. Esther was what? A Jew. Mordecai was what? Haman was what? You can tell me what he actually is, or you could just say Jew hater. Both of those are good. Good. You got the Agite? He's also a Jew hater, and you'll see some things why as we go through here. We're going to find out why he hates Jews and why he's so intent on having them destroyed. You look here in verse 21, though, let's spend some time with Mordecai. Mordecai is there, and he's sitting at the king's gate. Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officials, from those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So these two people, what do? What's their job? They guard the king. What's their thought? They're going to kill the king. So this is what we would call today a credible threat. The people who are guarding the king are putting a plot together to kill the king. So Mordecai overhears it. And what does Mordecai do? He tells Queen Esther in verse 22, and she tells the king in Mordecai's name. And this is going to be very important as we go through here. Because what does the king do once he figures this out? He hangs him. Verse 23, when the plot was investigated, found to be so, they were both hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of Chronicles in the king's presence. So this king investigates it, and it's pretty interesting because he seems to be thorough. We're going to talk a little bit later about why Haman was successful in getting his plot approved, and we'll talk about that. But here the plot was known, it was investigated, it was found to be true, so they were both hanged on a gallows. A lot of people hanging. You might want to turn your phone off if you haven't already. Mine just went off. Probably Scott Williams. He'll text me a lot of times. But here we go. A lot of people being hung in the book of Esther. And we're going to see that. Here's these two men. They were going to assassinate the king. They were hung. A record of it was written in the book of the Chronicles of the King. And that's going to become very important as you look at this. So, chapter 3. Chapter 3, verse 1. After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, and he goes on and talks about who he is, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. All the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down, paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. So we'll stop right there. Remember last week we mentioned some events. When we were dealing with Queen Vashti, and they had the banquet where he called all of his leaders and some of the military men, and they had this big, long, lavish banquet. What was going on in the history of the Persians at that point? Do you remember? They were getting ready to invade Greece. Okay. A few years passed, maybe like 3, I think. I don't know. I didn't figure out exactly. 3 or 4. And Esther is being made queen, and the events we're reading about are taking place. What has just happened? They lost. Oh, I forgot to put, I had some pictures, not actual pictures. I had some drawings of the king of Persia. He tried to cross the Hellespont, there, that narrow strip of water that separates Europe and Asia. And he had a boat. He tied boats together, according to history. And the storm came up and sunk his boats, his bridge that he built. So he had fetters cast into the water to control the water. And he had his priests and those type of people to go out in the water with whips and whip the water to punish it. Well, he eventually did get across. And he wasn't successful in invading all of Greece. So at this point in time, both of those are important. Last week I gave you a lot of, you probably thought was just random bits of information. We're going to tie it all together tonight. Him whipping and throwing chains into that strait of water tells you something about him. And the fact that it was a failure, his full invasion of Greece was a failure, tells you something else about what's going on right now. So he promotes Haman, and Haman has an idea. Well, first Haman wants everybody to worship him, and the king's okay with that. Commands it to be so. Who does not worship Haman? Mordecai. You look at verse 2 of chapter 3. And it says, but Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why are you transgressing the king's command? You go ahead and keep reading there. It says there in verse 4, now when it was when they had spoken daily to him, and he would not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, what was his reaction? Verse 5. Filled with rage. He's filled with rage. Let's continue reading. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Why do you think he might not have wanted to lay hands on Mordecai alone? Fear of what? Okay. The year of the king. What just happened? Remember in the chapter before? Saved the king's life. There are some other reasons. Maybe Haman, although he was a petty man, didn't want to display his pettiness necessarily. Like, all right, everybody knows that Mordecai didn't show me respect, and if I kill just Mordecai, then that looks like I'm a petty man. So I'm going to kill thousands of people. It's the way people think sometimes. Go ahead. Good. Okay. That's another way that's another possible reason about it too. Keep looking on down through here. Pure is the way it's said. Pure is the lot, the idea of casting a lot. That's going to come into play later here. In verse 8, Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of all other people. They do not observe the king's laws, so it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. There's a whole lot in this verse that explains some things. Even though Ahasuerus whipped the Hellespont and threw chains in it, when there were men, specific men accused of wanting to murder him, what was his reaction? Remember, in the last chapter, he did what? He investigated, and when he found it so, he hung them. So, he's a very complex individual. That might be a reason that Haman didn't want to go after just Mordecai. Because the king would seem to be, he seems to be one that investigates to see whether things so and then tries to render a fair ruling. I'm just throwing that out there. We don't really know why he didn't want to go after just Mordecai. But if you want to get rid of a group of people after a disastrous military campaign, what do? Hey, you know, there's a certain group of people, and they don't support you, king. They're different than we are. They have different customs. They talk different. They look different. They eat sauerkraut. Oh, wait, that's like World War I. Sorry. I'm just trying to show you that the exact reasoning he used has been used throughout history to go after a certain group of people. During World War I, you know, the German immigrants, they went, you know, our country, people in our country had a bias towards the German immigrants. You know, sauerkraut and things like that. Well, if you look in verse 8, Haman, look at his reasoning. Remember, a disastrous military expedition. They lost the big war in Greece at this point. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there's a certain people. Notice how they're diminished here and identified. They're scattered and dispersed among the peoples. Does that sound sinister? Here's a group of people, and they're scattered throughout your kingdom. They're not just in one area that we could like wall off. They're scattered everywhere. And he goes on down and he says, scattered and dispersed among the peoples, the provinces in your kingdom. Their laws are different from all those of the other people. They do not observe the king's laws. So it is not in your interest to keep them in there. And you can imagine, all right, just came off this big military defeat. Might be a little nervous about some things. One of the things you had to watch out for when you were a tyrant back then, not that I've been one, but I've read a lot, is that if you get defeated in a military campaign, a couple of things could happen. Your enemy over here, who saw that you were defeated over here, might think, oh, they're weakened, they're dispirited. Or, hey, they're occupied over here. And external enemies might start coming after you. Remember the Persian Empire, though. How many provinces they had. How many different peoples. Well, I go out as the leader, and I have a disastrous military campaign. The other thing I might need to start worrying about is my own kingdom fragmenting. An usurper, maybe. Somebody wanting to kill me and take my place. Interesting. I've always wondered why King Ahasuerus was so open to Haman's ideas. But I think if you look at what was going on in the kingdom, you can see why he was very open to that idea. He seems to be fair and just when it comes to individuals, but when it comes to peoples, those are just things to move around. Go ahead.
It's also interesting to note that Haman was a descendant of people that Saul was supposed to kill all the people
In 1 Samuel 15. Yep. Interesting. There's a lot of lessons we could draw, and that would be one of them. The consequences of not fully obeying God, even through the centuries as you look at it. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So, the king is favorable to Haman's idea? Or Haman's idea? He's favorable. And we talked about the reasons why as you go down through here. If it's pleasing to the king, verse 9, let it be decreed they shall be destroyed. I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business to put it into the king's treasuries. Verse 10, the king took his signet ring, gave it to Haman, the enemy of the Jews. The king said to Haman, the silver is yours, the people also. Do with them as you please. Motivated by rage and hatred, but also by what was Haman motivated by? Plunder. How does that play into later in the book of Esther? When they rose up to defend themselves, that was a huge point that they emphasized. They did not take any plunder. They did not. Over and over again, that'll be repeated. So just keep aware of that as we go. So, The king says, the silver is yours, people also, to do with them as you please. So then it's written into law, verse 12 down through there. Verse 13, letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all the Jews. Interesting. Norm? Look at this. This goes back to your point. To destroy, wait, lost my place. There we go. Verse 13, to destroy, to kill, annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, women and children. Do you know how that ties into your point? If you go back to 1 Samuel 15. Somebody want to turn there? Jump back there real quick. See the orders that are given to Samuel of what he's supposed to do to the Aggites. Just some interesting thoughts as we go through here. I hadn't thought of that until just now when Norm brought up about the Aggites in 1 Samuel 15. And then that phrase stuck in my mind. Do you have it yet? It's where he's given instructions to Saul what to do to the Aggites. Or the Amalekites.
Yeah, 15 is where he, verse 3 says, now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Okay,
I just think there's an interesting parallel there with the king Agag and the Amalekites and what we talked about and who Haman is descended from and just the consequences of Saul not fully obeying God back then. The consequences of Saul not fully obeying God went way beyond him losing the kingship or him not becoming king. It rolled down through the centuries and the generations and kind of tells you how insidious sin can be and the consequences of it. Just a side point. But anyway, back to Esther. We ran that rabbit till it was tired. Back to Esther. The edict is sent out. The couriers are sent out. And in chapter 4, verse 1, who learns of the plot? Mordecai does. He puts on sackcloth, ashes. He went out in the midst of the city, wailed loudly and bitterly. He went as far as the king's gate, for no one was to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. Esther hears about it, and she tries to send him some clothes. He refuses to put them on. So she sends out one of the eunuchs to talk to him. And he tells her what's going on. And what does Mordecai want Esther to do? Approach the king. Well, what's the problem with that? You need to be summoned first. If you approach the king and you haven't been summoned, what can happen to you? You can die. What just happened not long ago? 2 people who were the king's guards had plotted against him. You think he might be a little touchy about people coming around him that weren't summoned? This was probably a real concern of Esther as we look at it. So don't minimize her concern as you look at it. So you're going down through here, and she's going to go and she's going to petition the king. So what happens there? He receives her, so she's not going to be killed. What does she do? Okay? She has a banquet. Who's invited to the banquet? The king and Haman. So, the queen throws a banquet, and the king's there, and you're Haman. Yes! I'm eating with the king and the queen. So he's feeling pretty good about himself. Here's where his timing gets to be just really bad. So you go and you look, as we're going down through here, what happens at that banquet? Okay, so she has another banquet. Does anything happen at the first banquet? Anything noteworthy to the whole story?
When Haman departed the first banquet, he has to walk past Mordecai.
Okay.
Who does not tremble or
Oh, so what's that do?
Ruins his day.
Ruins his day. He's filled with anger again, isn't he? But hey, the king and queen wanted me at a banquet, right? So you continue going on. You can read about that in chapter 5, verse 9. Haman went out that day, glad, was pleased of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he did not stand up or tremble before him, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. Verse 10, Haman controlled himself, however, went into his house and sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. He recounted to them the glory of his riches, the number of his sons, every instance where the king had magnified him and how he promoted him above the princes and the servants of the king. Verse 12, Haman also said, even Esther the queen, let no one but me come with the king to the banquet which she had prepared. And tomorrow I am also invited by her with the king. Have you figured out who Haman is? Okay, you know there's types of people. Have you figured out what type of person Haman is? Stuck on himself, power hungry. I look at him as he's a little man. He's a little man that isn't satisfied with his honor and who he is and his own accomplishments. He has to have people bowing down to him. He has to come and tell his friends how much money he's got. And it's going to go on and on. So he's got a good quality, right?
Well, he calls his wife and all his friends together, and he brags on himself all that time. But verse 13, yet all of this does not satisfy me. Every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate.
There you go. So that's after the first banquet. Here comes the second banquet. Well, okay, you said he listened to his wife. What was her idea? Build a gallows. Okay, maybe he shouldn't have listened to his wife. We're going to see later. So you look here, she says in verse 14 of chapter 5, build a gallows 50 cubits high, made in the morning, ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it, then go joyfully with the king to the banquet. The advice pleased Haman, so that he had the gallows made. So the next banquet, what goes on there? Okay, the king couldn't sleep that night before the next banquet. So what do you do when you can't sleep sometimes? You get up and read. You know, maybe it'll cause you to fall asleep. What does he happen to read? The Chronicles, and about how a certain person saved his life from 2 assassins. And who is that certain person? Mordecai. Good, look at that. He goes on down, that's in the first part of chapter 6. What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this, he says. And the king's servant says, nothing has been done for him. So it's fresh on his mind what Mordecai has done. It's fresh on his mind that nothing's been done for this man, you know, out of gratitude. And we go to the next day. It says, now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows which he had prepared for him. The master of poor timing. That's what I mentioned. The king's servant said to him, behold, Haman is standing in the court. And he said, let him come in. So Haman came in. The king said to him, what is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor? And Haman thought, who else could he desire to honor other than me? So he gives him all these elaborate things that should be done. And the king says, great idea. Go do it to Mordecai. And we'll see how this is playing out here as we go. So he has to honor Mordecai, which doesn't please him at all. Look at chapter 7. Now when the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen, the king said to Esther on the second day also, as they drank at the banquet, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. We see that in the Bible all the time. Usually it doesn't turn out well. Think John the Baptist, you know, anything you want. That's just one of those things to remember in your own life. Before you make a blanket statement like that, it could go bad. So he says, what is your request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be done. Queen Esther replies in verse 3, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me as my petition and my people as my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. Now, if we'd only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent. For the trouble would not have be commensurate with the annoyance to the king. So can you imagine the king? Here's his queen, who he favors. And he says, you can have anything you want up to half the kingdom. And she says, can I have my life and the life of my people? Because somebody's going to destroy us all. Well, what would your response be as king? Who's going to do this to my queen? So that's the response that goes. Verse 5, King Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther, who is he and where is he? That kind of shows you his mindset. Not just who is he, but where is he? That would presume to do such a thing. Esther said, a foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman. Who is what? Sitting right there. Eating at her table. I find a lot of humorous in Esther as you go down through here. I know it's not a funny story about people getting killed and all that, but it's ironic, it's interesting. You can see God's hands in things as we go. Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. So, long story short, what happens? They hang him, and his sons on the gallows he made. See, that's why you shouldn't listen to your wife. Wait, no. That's the wrong conclusion to draw from that. But remember, it was her idea to build the gallows that her husband and 10 sons were hung on. She did, didn't she? Once she found out what was going on, she gave accurate advice, or an accurate comment. But anyway, Haman and his sons are hung on the gallows. They come up with a time where the Jews can do what? They don't revoke the law. Why don't they revoke the law? Because it can't be, because of the nature of their laws. Once the king had signed it into effect, it stayed into effect. So if you can't revoke that law to slaughter the Jews, what can you do? You can let them fight back. And that's exactly what happens. They write a law to where the Jews can resist and fight back to preserve their lives. So I haven't been keeping up here. Oh, these would have been helpful, wouldn't they? Haman dies on the gallows, prepared for Mordecai. Mordecai's given Haman's house and his position, you'll see here in a little bit. Chapter 8, beginning in verse 4. The king extended the golden scepter to Esther, so Esther arose, stood before the king. She says, if it pleases the king, and I have found favor before him, and the matter seems proper to the king, I am pleasing in his sight, let it be written. And then they have the plan, the Jews can defend themselves as we go through here. So, as you look down through the end of Esther, the day comes. Actually, there's a couple days, depending on whether you're in rural Persia, or Shushan, Persia, or whether you were in the city, if you want to get down to dividing up between the days. But the short of it is, go ahead, Milton. Mm-hmm. Yeah, put a little tears on it. I think you're right, just by the way that's phrased and everything, and we know that she had favor in his sight. So the short of the Esther, the rest of the story of Esther, is the Jews do rise up, they defend themselves. How many do they kill of their enemies? Do you remember? There's a number sticking in my head. 75,000 as you get down in there. I was trying to find the verse. 9:17, 16. There we go. Now the rest of the Jews, in chapter 9, verse 16, the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces assembled to defend their lives, rid themselves of their enemies, killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they did not lay hands on their plunder. In verse 18, the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 13th and the 14th of the same month. They rested on the 15th day, made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. So at least 75,000 people died because of Haman's plot. But it wasn't the Jews. We don't have any accounts of Jewish casualties, do we? That's interesting when you look at it. Norm?
Not only did the Jews kill these other people, but the king offered his help from his army to be a help to it as well.
Okay. Who was the biggest help? God. His name's not mentioned in the book, but his hand is everywhere through the book of Esther. And so they overcome that. There's a feast called Purim that we see being instituted to commemorate this salvation of the Jews. And now let's look at some things. So that's the story, roughly, of Esther, which we studied a couple of years ago, so you should be familiar with it if you were in that class. Now, Jews who did not return to Judah. Remember last week, I proposed some things for you to think about. Here was the prophecies from Isaiah, Jeremiah. They'd urged the yet-to-be-exiled nation to come out of Babylon. Isaiah 48:20, Jeremiah 29:10 through 14, 58, 51, 6. We looked at those last week. They were prophecies saying, come out. They were prophecies saying, I'll bring my people back. Those type of prophecies. Some did not return. We know that because we just read about them in Esther. Esther, and we looked at Ezra 1, 5, and 6, where the ones that left to go back to Jerusalem were supported by gifts from those who stayed. So a lot of Jews did not return to Judah. Here were some questions. We looked at some possible reasons for not returning. And we asked the question. I'd never considered it before, but in my study, it was being brought up. Are the ones who didn't return faithful, or were they disobedient to God? Were they apathetic, disobedient? Were they wrong in not returning? And people that say that they were wrong in not returning will cite things like the lack of God being mentioned in Esther, that to indicate that maybe they weren't faithful Jews. And we talked about all that last week. And I said I was still thinking about it. Well, I think personally I've come to a decision here as we look. And we'll stop right here. Go ahead, Milton. Exactly. Here. You know where we're going. I think Milton is exactly right, and that these Jews weren't disobedient, and these Jews weren't, as far as one commentator went to call them, these Jews weren't sinners, but they were a part of God's plan. And even if they were apathetic, and even if they were unfaithful, God could still use them. But I don't think those prophecies said every single Jew has to come home. Look at the outline of this Persian Empire. This is the map we looked at when we started looking at Esther. Absorb the outline of that map. If you look here, there's a little bit of Greece right there, Macedonia, and then it gets over into Turkey and Asia Minor, and then it goes down through Syria and Damascus, and goes over to Libya, and there's Cyrene, and down into Egypt, and then it goes over past Babylonia. Well, it goes way over to India. But see the Persian Gulf there? Take note of that outline. That'll give you a reference for the next thing you're going to look at. Acts chapter 2. Yeah? Okay. Good. Here's how I think God used these people to fulfill his plan. Not just for the Messiah to come, but for the kingdom to spread. So you see that outline there. Persian Gulf. Note that. This is a map that shows Acts chapter 2. You know, all the nations that are mentioned being there in Acts chapter 2. The Jews came for the Pentecost from all over the place, and they heard preaching, and the gospel was preached, and the first converts were there. Look at where they came from on this map. With the exception, really, of Rome, pretty much all of them are dispersed Jews that were in descendants of the ones that were dispersed in the Persian Empire. Just notice how God used the descendants of people like Esther and Mordecai and those Jews. I just put some things together. Note the role of the descendants of non-returning Jews. Acts chapter 2, they came on Pentecost. Those people heard the gospel. Then what did they do? Then they returned to their homeland. Can you imagine? Let's go back. Can you imagine? All these people come together. They hear the gospel. All those wonderful things go on. And after a little while, they scatter about through the whole empire again. So there's Acts 2. Look at Acts chapter 9. Turn there. We're going to look at several passages in Acts, so you can jump up there real quick. Acts chapter 9, verse 19. And he took food and was strengthened, and for several days he was with the disciples who were at Damascus. Immediately began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogue, saying, He is the Son of God. Talking about Paul here, previously Saul. He was with the disciples who were where? In Jerusalem? Damascus. What was Damascus? Remember part of the first map I showed you? Part of the Persian Empire. Those were Jews who didn't return home. And what was there? This is another thing. Verse 20, what was there? A synagogue. How did Paul use synagogues? There's you a sermon. Paul's use of synagogues. He would go into town, and as his custom was, he would go into a synagogue. Why were there synagogues in all these far-flung towns? Because there were dispersed Jews living in those towns, and they built synagogues. See how these scattered Jews that did not return home fit into the gospel age? Well, their descendants did. They fit into the gospel age. The expanding of the Messiah's kingdom. How God used them. We can look at some others too. Acts 13. Flip over there. But you should be starting to get the idea now that how God used these. Verse 4. Being sent out by the Holy Spirit, they went to Seleucia, and from there they sailed to Cyprus. When they reached Salamis, they began to proclaim the word of God in the synagogues of the Jews. And they had also had John as their keeper. I'm not sure Cyprus was part of the island was part of the Persian Empire. I'd have to check. But there's your idea of there's a synagogue on Cyprus. Why is there a synagogue on Cyprus? Because those Jews did not return home. And look how these synagogues are used to spread the word. That is usually the first place that the apostles and the missionaries and that we read about in Acts. That was usually the first place they went in order to preach the gospel. Let's look at another one. Acts 14, verse 1. Here's another one. In Iconium they entered the synagogue of the Jews together. There you go. Iconium is in Turkey. Remember we pointed out Turkey? Solidly in the Persian Empire that we looked at the Persian Empire in Esther's time. The Romans came and, ruined it all, but for the Persians at least. But it's the same area, the same people, their descendants. And Acts 18, you flip over there, a similar thing. There was a lot of passages that we could look at as you go through there. In Acts 18, starting in verse 18, Paul, having remained many days longer, took leave of the brethren, put out to sea for Syria, the old Persian Empire. With him were Priscilla and Aquila. In Centuria, he had his hair cut, for he's keeping vows. They came to Ephesus, that's part of the Asia Minor there, where those dispersed Jews, their descendants would have been. Now he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. God used these dispersed Jews to not just establish the kingdom, but to spread it and to strengthen it. I mean, look at what have those synagogues... Can you imagine going into each town if all the Jews had gone back to Judah? And there was nobody, you'd be starting with a clean slate. There was nobody that had a background of who God was. There was nobody that, had the Old Testament law and was familiar with the arguments that the apostles could make. But because they stayed dispersed, a lot of them, they were ready-made. Paul could go into town, he could preach the gospel in synagogues, people would know and understand what he was talking about, and they could obey the gospel, and the church could spread.
Not only because they stayed, but also because in Esther's time God saved them.
In Esther's, yeah, because if all the Jews had been killed, why would there be synagogues? Oh man, I got so many hands.
I considered this, that when they came, heard the gospel once, first time, and noticed that the lead went back to these far-flung countries they came from, was the prophets of God.
Yep.
They retained it and were able to at least make some effort to spread the fact that God was there for their benefit.
Okay? So look at Esther. Because God saved the Jews in Esther, they were still there and dispersed with synagogues all around, and we saw how God used the synagogues to disperse the gospel and how he used those Jews to disperse the gospel. And let's get through this one real quick. The story of Esther would encourage the Jews in Jerusalem in their work, even the later Jews who came and built the walls and things. You would hear stories about how God saved the people, that salvation. God protects. Remember at the beginning of Haggai? Well, 16 years before Haggai, the people stopped working because they were what? Terrified and afraid of the people around them. Well, you throw a story like Esther on them, that should take care of some of your terrification and fear. That should be encouraging to you. Encourage Jews everywhere till the Messiah came. Assure them that the Lord of hosts would take care of his people. It would explain the Feast of Purim, because in chapter 9, they go on and... You want to do this? Chapter 9, they go on with the Feast of Purim and explain to subsequent Jews about the salvation of God, and they kept it every year, and then other lessons that we could have talked about. So, we're done with Esther. We're going to move on and start building walls now, I think. So we'll see what goes on. I'll send out a worksheet before Sunday.